Chapter 9. Titus, when the Jews were not all mollified by his leaving off the siege for a while, set himself again to prosecute the same, but soon sent Josephus to discourse with his own countrymen about peace. A resolution was now taken by Titus to relax the siege for a little while, and to afford the seditious an interval for consideration, and to see whether the demolishing of their second wall would not make them a little more compliant, or whether they were not somewhat afraid of a famine, because the spoils they had gotten by rapine would not be sufficient for them long. So he made use of this relaxation in order to compass his own designs. Accordingly, as the usual appointed time when he must distribute subsistence money to the soldiers was now come, he gave orders that the commanders should put the army into battle array in the face of the enemy, and then give every one of the soldiers their pay. So the soldiers, according to custom, opened the cases wherein their arms lay before covered, and marched with their breastplates on, as did the horsemen lead their horses in their fine trappings. Then did the places that were before the city shine very splendidly for a great way, nor was there anything so grateful to Titus's own men, or so terrible to the enemy as that sight. For the whole old wall and the north side of the temple were full of spectators, and one might see the houses full of such as looked at them, nor was there any part of the city which was not covered over with their multitudes. Nay, a very great consternation seized upon the hardiest of the Jews themselves, when they saw all the army in the same place, together with the fineness of their arms and the good order of their men. And I cannot but think that the seditious would have changed their minds at that sight, unless the crimes they had committed against the people had been so horrid that they despaired of forgiveness from the Romans. But as they believed death with torments must be their punishment if they did not go on in the defense of the city, they thought it much better to die in war. Fate also prevailed so far over them that the innocent were to perish with the guilty, and the city was to be destroyed with the seditious that were in it. Thus did the Romans spend 4 days in bringing the subsistence money to the several legions. But on the 5th day, when no signs of peace appeared to come from the Jews, Titus divided his legions and began to raise banks, both at the tower of Antonia and at John's monument. Now his designs were to take the upper city at that monument, and the temple at the tower of Antonia. For if the temple were not taken, it would be dangerous to keep the city itself. So at each of these parts he raised him banks, each legion raising one. As for those that wrought at John's monument, the Idumeans, and those that were in arms with Simon, made sallies upon them, and put some stop to them, while John's party, and the multitude of zealots with them, did the like to those that were before the tower of Antonia. These Jews were now too hard for the Romans, not only in direct fighting because they stood upon the higher ground, but because they had now learned to use their own engines, for their continual use of them one day after another did by degrees improve their skill about them. For one sort of engines for darts they had 300, and 40 for stones, by the means of which they made it more tedious for the Romans to raise their banks. But then Titus, knowing that the city would either be saved or destroyed for himself, did not only proceed earnestly in the siege, but did not omit to have the Jews exhorted to repentance. So he mixed good counsel with his works for the siege. And being sensible that exhortations are frequently more effectual than arms, he persuaded them to surrender the city, now in a manner already taken, and thereby to save themselves, and sent Josephus to speak to them in their own language, for he imagined they might yield to the persuasion of a countryman of their own. So Josephus went round about the wall, and tried to find a place that was out of the reach of their darts, and yet within their hearing, and besought them, in many words, to spare themselves, to spare their country and their temple, and not to be more obdurate in these cases than foreigners themselves, for that the Romans, who had no relation to those things, had a reverence for their sacred rights and places, although they belonged to their enemies, and till now kept their hands off from meddling with them, while such as were brought up under them, and, if they be preserved, will be the only people that will reap the benefit of them, hurry on to have them destroyed. That certainly they have seen their strongest walls demolished, and that the wall still remaining was weaker than those that were already taken, that they must know the Romans' power was invincible, and that they had been used to serve them, for in case it be allowed a right thing to fight for liberty, that ought to have been done at first. But for them that have once fallen under the power of the Romans, and have now submitted to them for so many long years, to pretend to shake off that yoke afterward was the work of such as had a mind to die miserably, not of such as were lovers of liberty. Besides, men may well enough grudge at the dishonor of owning ignoble masters over them, but ought not to do so to those that have all things under their command. For what part of the world is there that hath escaped the Romans, unless it be such as are of no use for violent heat or for violent cold? And evident it is that fortune on all hands gone over to them, and that God, when he had gone round the nations with this dominion, had now settled in Italy. That moreover it is a strong and fixed law, even among brute beasts, as well as among men, to yield to those that are too strong for them, and to stiffer those that to have the dominion, who are too hard for the rest in war. For which reason it was that their forefathers, who were far superior to them, both in their souls and bodies, and other advantages, did yet submit to the Romans, which they would not have suffered, had they not known that God was with them. As for themselves, what can they depend on in this their opposition, when the greatest part of their city is already taken, and when those that are within it are under greater miseries than if they were taken, although their walls be still standing? For that the Romans are not unacquainted with that famine which is in the city, whereby the people are already consumed, and the fighting men will in little time be so too. For although the Romans should leave off the siege and not fall upon the city with their swords in their hands, yet was there an insuperable war that beset them within, and was augmented every hour, unless they were able to wage war with famine, and fight against it, or could alone conquer their natural appetites. He added this further, how right a thing it was to change their conduct before the calamities were become incurable, and have recourse to such advice as might preserve them, while opportunity was offered for them doing so. For that the Romans would not be mindful of their past actions to their disadvantage, unless they persevered in their insolent behavior to the end, because they were naturally mild in their conquests, and preferred what was profitable before what their passions dictated to them. Which profit of theirs lay not in leaving the city empty of inhabitants, nor the country a desert, on which account Caesar did now offer them his right hand for their security. Whereas if he took the city by force, he could not save any of them, and this especially if they rejected his offers in these their utmost distress. For the walls that were already taken could not but assure them, but the third wall would quickly be taken also. And though their fortifications should prove too strong for the Romans to break through them, yet would the famine fight for the Romans against them. While Josephus was making this exhortation to the Jews, many of them jested upon him from the wall, and many reproached him, nay, some threw their darts at him. But when he could not himself persuade them by such open good advice, he betook himself to the histories belonging to their own nation, and cried out aloud, quote, O miserable creatures, are you so unmindful of those that used to assist you, that you will fight by your own weapons and by your hands against the Romans? When did we ever conquer any other nation by such means? And when was it that God, who is the creator of the Jewish people, did not avenge them when they had been injured? Will you not turn again and look back and consider them when they had been, whence it is you fight with such violence, and how great a supporter you have profanely abused? Will you not recall to mind the prodigious things done for your forefathers and this holy place, and how great enemies of yours were by him subdued under you? I even tremble myself in declaring the works of God before your ears, that are unworthy to hear them. However, hearken to me, that you may be informed how you fight not only against the Romans, but against God himself. In old times there was Necho, king of Egypt, who was also called Pharaoh. He came with a prodigious army of soldiers and seized Queen Sarah, the mother of our nation. What did Abraham, our progenitor, then do? Did he defend himself from this injurious person by war, although he had 318 captains under him, and an immense army under each of them? Indeed, he deemed them to be no number at all without God's assistance, and only spread out his hands toward this holy place, which you have now polluted, and reckoned upon him as upon his invincible supporter, instead of his own army. Was not our queen sent back, without any defilement, to her husband the very next evening? While the king of Egypt fled away, adoring this place, which you have defiled by shedding thereon the blood of your own countrymen, and also trembled at those visions which he saw in the night season, and bestowed both silver and gold on the Hebrews, as on a people beloved by God. Shall I say nothing, or shall I mention the removal of our fathers into Egypt, who, when they were used tyrannically, and were fallen under the power of foreign kings for 400 years together, and might have defended themselves by war and by fighting, yet did do nothing but commit themselves to God? Who is there that does not know that Egypt was overrun with all sorts of wild beasts, and consumed by all sorts of distempers? How their land did not bring forth its fruit, how the Nile failed of water, how the 10 plagues of Egypt followed one upon another, and how by those means our fathers were sent away under a guard, without any bloodshed, and without running any dangers, because God conducted them as his peculiar servants. Moreover, did not Palestine groan under the ravage of the Assyrians made when they carried away our sacred ark, as did their idol Dagon, and as also did that entire nation of those that carried it away, how they were smitten with the loathsome distemper in the secret parts of their bodies, when their very bowels came down together with what they had eaten, till those hands that stole it away were obliged to bring it back again, and that with the sound of cymbals and timbrels and other oblations, in order to appease the anger of God for their violation of his holy ark. It was God who then became our general, and accomplished these great things for our fathers, and this because they did not meddle with war and fighting, but committed it to him to judge about their affairs. When Sennacherib, king of Assyria, brought along with him all Asia, and encompassed the city round with his army, did he fall by the hands of men? Were not those hands lifted up to God in prayers without meddling with their arms, when an angel of God destroyed that prodigious army in one night? When the Assyrian king, as he rose the next day, found 180,500 dead bodies, and when he with the remainder of his army fled away from the Hebrews, though they were unarmed and did not pursue them. You are also acquainted with the slavery we were under at Babylon, where the people were captives for 70 years. Yet were they not delivered into freedom again before God made Cyrus his gracious instrument in bringing it about? Accordingly they were set free by him, and did again restore the worship of their deliverer at his temple. And to speak in general, we can produce no example wherein our fathers got any success by war, or failed of success when without war they committed themselves to God. When they stayed at home they conquered, as pleased their judge, but when they went out to fight, they were always disappointed. For example, when the king of Babylon besieged this very city, and our king Zedekiah fought against him, contrary to what predictions were made to him by Jeremiah the prophet, he was at once taken prisoner, and saw the city and the temple demolished. Yet how much greater was the moderation of that king than is that of your present governors, and of that the people then under him, than is of you at this time. For when Jeremiah cried aloud, how very angry God was with them because of their transgressions, and told them they should be taken prisoners, unless they would surrender up their city, neither did the king nor the people put him to death. But for you, to pass over what you have done within the city, which I am not able to describe as your wickedness deserves, you abuse me and throw darts at me, who only exhort you to save yourselves, as being provoked when you are put into mind of your own sins, and cannot bear the very mention of those crimes which you every day perpetrate. For another example, when Antiochus, who was called Epiphanes, lay before the city, and had been guilty of many indignities against God, and our forefathers met him in arms, they then were slain in the battle. The city was plundered by our enemies, and our sanctuary made desolate for 3 years and 6 months. And what need I bring any more examples? Indeed, what can it be that hath stirred up an army of the Romans against our nation? Is it not the impiety of the inhabitants? Whence did our servitude commence? Was it not derived from the seditions that were among our forefathers, when the madness of Aristobulus and Hyrcanus, and our mutual quarrels brought Pompey upon the city, and when God reduced those under subjection to the Romans who were unworthy of the liberty that they had enjoyed? After a siege, therefore, of 3 months, they were forced to surrender themselves, although they had not been guilty of such offenses with regard to our sanctuary and our laws, as you have. And this while they had much greater advantages to go to war than you have. Do not we know what end Antigonus, the son of Aristobulus, came to, under whose reign God provided that this city should be taken again upon account of the people's offenses? When Herod, the son of Antipater, brought us upon Sosius, and Sosius brought upon us the Roman army, they were then encompassed and besieged for 6 months, till, as a punishment for their sins, they were taken, and the city was plundered by the enemy. Thus it appears that arms were never given to our nation, but that we are always given up to be fought against, and to be taken. For I suppose that such as inhabit this holy place ought to commit the disposal of all things to God, and then only to disregard the assistance of men when they resign themselves up to their arbitrator, who is above. As for you, what have you done of those things that are recommended by our legislator? And what have you not done of those things that he hath condemned? How much more impious are you than those who were so quickly taken? You have not avoided so much as those sins that are usually done in secret. I mean thefts and treacherous plots against men and adulteries. You are quarreling about rapines and murders, and invent strange ways of wickedness. Nay, the temple itself has become the receptacle of all, and this divine place is polluted by the hands of those of our own country, which place hath yet been reverenced by the Romans when it was at a distance from them, when they have suffered many of their own customs to give place to our law. And after all of this, do you expect him whom you have so impiously abused to be your supporter? To be sure, you have a right to be petitioners, and call upon him to assist you, so pure are your hands. Did your king Hezekiah lift up such hands in prayer to God against the king of Assyria, when he destroyed that great army in one night? And do the Romans commit such wickedness as did the king of Assyria, that you may have reason to hope for the like of vengeance upon them? Did not that king accept of money from our king on this condition, that he should not destroy the city, and yet, contrary to the oath he had taken, he came down to burn the temple? While the Romans do demand no more than that accustomed tribute which our fathers paid to their fathers. And if they may but once obtain that, they neither aim to destroy this city, nor to touch this sanctuary. Nay, they will grant you besides that your posterity shall be free, and your possessions secured to you, and will preserve our holy laws inviolate to you. And it is plain madness to expect that God should appear as well disposed toward the wicked as towards the righteous, since he knows when it is proper to punish men for their sins immediately. Accordingly, he brake the power of the Assyrians the very first night that they pitched their camp. Wherefore he had judged that our nation was worthy of freedom, or the Romans of punishment, and he had immediately inflicted punishment upon those Romans as he did upon the Assyrians, when Pompey began to meddle with our nation, or when after him Sosius came up against us, or when Vespasian laid waste to Galilee, or lastly when Titus came first of all near to this city, although Magnus and Sosius did not only suffer nothing, but took the city by force, as did Vespasian go from the war he made against you to receive the empire. And as for Titus, those springs that were formerly almost dried up when they were under your power, since he is come, run more plentifully than they did before. Accordingly, you know that Siloam, as well as the other springs that were without the city, did so far fail, that water was sold by distinct measures, whereas they now have such a great quantity of water for your enemies, as is sufficiently not only for drink both for themselves and their cattle, but for watering their gardens also. The same wonderful sign you had also experienced formerly, when the forementioned king of Babylon made war against us, and when he took the city and burnt the temple, while yet I believe the Jews of that age were not so as impious as you are. Wherefore I cannot but suppose that God has fled out of his sanctuary, and stands on the side of those against whom you fight. Now even a man, if he be but a good man, will fly from an impure house, and will hate those that are in it. And do you persuade yourselves that God will abide with you in your iniquities, who sees all secret things, and hears what is kept most private? Now what crime is there, I pray you, that is so much as kept secret among you, or is concealed by you? Nay, what is there that is not open to your very enemies? For you show your transgressions after a pompous manner, and contend one with another, which of you shall be more wicked than another. And you make a public demonstration of your injustice, as if it were virtue. However, there is a place left for your preservation, if you be willing to accept of it. And God is easily reconciled to those that confess their faults and repent of them. O hard-hearted wretches as you are, cast away all your arms, and take pity of your country, already going to ruin. Return from your wicked ways, and have regard to the excellency of that city which you are going to betray, to that excellent temple with the donations of so many countries in it. Who could bear to be the first that should set that temple on fire? Who could be willing that these things should be no more? And what is there that can better deserve to be preserved? O insensible creatures, and more stupid than are the stones themselves! If you cannot look at these things with discerning eyes, yet, however, have pity upon your families, and set before every one of your eyes your children and wives and parents, who will be gradually consumed either by famine or by war. I am sensible that this danger will extend to my mother and wife, and to that family of mine who have been by no means ignoble, and indeed to one that hath been very eminent in old time. And perhaps you may imagine that it is on their account only that I give you this advice. If that be all, kill them, nay, take my own blood as a reward, if it may but procure your preservation. For I am ready to die, in case you will but return to a sound mind after my death. Chapter 10. How a great many of the people earnestly endeavored to desert to the Romans, as also what intolerable things those that stayed behind suffered by famine, and the sad consequences thereof. As Josephus was speaking thus with a loud voice, the seditious would neither yield to what he said, nor did they deem it safe for them to alter their conduct. But as for the people, they had a great inclination to desert to the Romans. Accordingly, some of them sold what they had, and even the most precious things that had been laid up as treasures by them for every small matter, and swallowed down pieces of gold, that they might not be found out by the robbers, and when they had escaped to the Romans, went to stool, and had therewithal to provide plentifully for themselves. For Titus let a great number of them go away into the country, whither they pleased. And the main reasons why they were so ready to desert were these, that they now should be freed from those miseries which they had endured in that city, and yet should not be in slavery to the Romans. However, John and Simon, with their factions, did more carefully watch these men's going out than they did the coming of the Romans. And if any one did but afford the least shadow of suspicion of such an intention, his throat was cut immediately. But as for the richer sort, it proved all one to them whether they stayed in the city or attempted to get out of it, for they were equally destroyed in both cases. For every such person was put to death under this pretense, that they were going to desert, but in reality that the robbers might get what they had. The madness of the seditious did also increase together with their famine, and both these miseries were every day inflamed more and more, for there was no corn which anywhere appeared publicly, but the robbers came running into and searched men's private houses, and then if they found any, they tormented them, because they had denied they had any. And if they found none, they tormented them worse, because they supposed they had more carefully concealed it. The indication they made use of, whether they had any or not, was taken from the bodies of those miserable wretches, which, if they were in good case, they supposed that they were in no want at all of food. But if they were wasted away, they walked off without searching any further, nor did they think it proper to kill such as these, because they saw they would very soon die of themselves for want of food. Many there were, indeed, who sold what they had for one measure. It was of wheat, if they were of the richer sort, or of barley, if they were poorer. When these had done so, they shut themselves up in the inmost rooms of their houses, and ate the corn they had gotten. Some did it without grinding it, by reason of the extremity of the want they were in, and others baked bread of it, according as necessity and fear dictated to them. A table was nowhere laid for a distinct meal, but they snatched the bread out of the fire half-baked, and ate it very hastily. It was now a miserable case, and a sight that would justly bring tears into our eyes, how men stood as to their food, while the more powerful had more than enough, and the weaker were lamenting for want of it. But the famine was too hard for all other passions, and it is destructive to nothing so much as to modesty, for what was otherwise worthy of reverence was in this case despised, insomuch that children pulled the very morsels that their fathers were eating out of their very mouths, and what was still more to be pitied, so did the mothers do as to their infants. And when those that were most dear were perishing under their hands, they were not ashamed to take from them the very last drops that might preserve their lives. And while they ate after this manner, yet they were not concealed in so doing, but the seditious everywhere came upon them immediately, and snatched away from them what they had gotten from others. For when they saw any house shut up, this was to them a signal that the people within had gotten some food, whereupon they broke open the doors, ran in, and took pieces of what they were eating almost up out of their very throats, and this by force. The old men who held their food fast were beaten, and if the women hid what they had within their hands, their hair was torn for so doing. Nor was there any commiseration shown either to the aged or the infants, but they lifted up children from the ground as they hung upon the morsels they had gotten, and shook them down upon the floor. But still they were more barbarously cruel to those that had prevented their coming in, and had actually swallowed down what they were going to seize upon, as if they had been unjustly defrauded of their right. They also invented terrible methods of torments to discover where any food was, and they were these to stop up the passages of the privy parts of the miserable wretches, and to drive sharp stakes up their fundaments, and a man was forced to bear what is terrible even to hear, in order to make him confess that he had but one loaf of bread, or that he might discover a handful of barley meal that was concealed. And this was done when these tormentors were not themselves hungry, for the thing had been less barbarous had necessity forced them to it. But this was done to keep their madness in exercise, and as making preparation of provisions for themselves for the following days. These men went also to meet those that had crept out of the city by night, as far as the Roman guards, to gather some plants and herbs that grew wild. And when these people thought they had got clear of the enemy, they snatched them from what they had brought with them, even while they had frequently entreated them, and that by calling upon the tremendous name of God to give them back some part of what they had brought, though these would not give them the least crumb, for they were to be well contented that they were only spoiled and not slain at the same time. These were the afflictions which the lower sort of people suffered from these tyrants' guards. But for the men that were in dignity, and withal were rich, they were carried before the tyrants themselves, some of whom were falsely accused of laying treacherous plots, and so were destroyed. Others of them were charged with designs of betraying the city to the Romans. But the readiest way of all was this, to suborn somebody to affirm that they were resolved to desert to the enemy. And he who was utterly despoiled of what they had by Simon was sent back again to John, as those who had been already plundered by Jotre Simon got what remained, insomuch as they drank the blood of the populace to one another, and divided the dead bodies of the poor creatures between them, so that although, on account of their ambition after dominion, they contended with each other, yet they did very well agree in their wicked practices. For he that did not communicate what he got by the miseries to others, to the other tyrant, seemed to be a little too guilty, and in one respect only, and he did not partake of what was so communicated to him, grieved at this, as at the loss of what was a valuable thing, that he had no share in such barbarity. It is therefore impossible to go distinctly over every instance of these men's iniquity. I shall therefore speak my mind here at once briefly, that neither did any other city ever suffer such miseries, nor did any age ever breed a generation more fruitful in wickedness than this was, from the beginning of the world. Finally, they brought the Hebrew nation into contempt, that they might themselves appear comparatively less impious with regard to strangers. They confessed what was true, that they were the slaves, the scum, and the spurious and abortive offspring of our nation, while they overthrew the city themselves and forced the Romans, whether they would or no, to gain a melancholy reputation by acting gloriously against them, and did almost draw that fire upon the temple, which they seemed to think came too slowly. And indeed, when they saw that the temple burning from the upper city, they were neither troubled at all, nor did they shed any tears on that account, while yet these passions were discovered among the Romans themselves, which circumstances we shall speak of hereafter in their proper place, when we come to treat of such matters. Chapter 11. How the Jews were crucified before the walls of the city, concerning Antiochus Epiphanes, and how the Jews overthrew the banks that had been raised by the Romans. So now Titus's banks were advanced a great way, notwithstanding his soldiers had been very much distressed from the wall. He then sent a party of horsemen and ordered that they should lay ambushes for those that went out into the valleys to gather food. Some of these were indeed fighting men who were not contented with what they got by rapine, but the greater part of them were poor people who were deterred from deserting by the concern they were under for their own relations, for they could not hope to escape away, together with their wives and children, without the knowledge of the seditious. Nor could they think of leaving these relations to be slain by the robbers on their account. Nay, the severity of the famine made them bold in thus going out. So nothing remained but that, when they were concealed from the robbers, they should be taken by the enemy, and when they were going to be taken, they were forced to defend themselves for fear of being punished, as after they had fought. They thought it too late to make any supplications for mercy, so they were first whipped and then tormented with all sorts of tortures before they died, and were then crucified before the wall of the city. This miserable procedure made Titus greatly to pity them, while they caught every day 500 Jews. Nay, some days they caught more. Yet it did not appear to be safe for him to let those that were taken by force go their way, and to set guard over so many he saw would be to make such a great deal them useless to him. The main reason why he did not forbid that cruelty was this, that he hoped the Jews might perhaps yield at that sight, out of fear lest they might find themselves afterwards to be liable to the same cruel treatment. So the soldiers, out of the wrath and hatred they bore the Jews, nailed those they caught, one after one way, to the crosses, by way of jest, when their multitude was so great that room was wanting for the crosses, and crosses wanting for the bodies. But so far were the seditious from repenting at this sad sight, that, on the contrary, they made the rest of the multitude believe otherwise. For they brought the relations of those that had deserted upon the wall with such of the populace as were very eager to go over upon the security offered them, and showed them what miseries those underwent who fled to the Romans, and told them that those who were caught were supplicants to them, and not such as were taken prisoner. This sight kept many of those within the city who were so eager to desert, till the truth was known. Yet did some of them run away immediately as to certain punishment, esteeming death from their enemies to be a quiet departure, if compared with that by famine. So Titus commanded that the hands of many of those that were caught should be cut off, that they might not be thought deserters, and might be credited on account of the calamity they were under, and sent them into John and Simon, with this exhortation, that they would know at length leave off their madness, and not force him to destroy the city, whereby they would have those advantages of repentance, even in their utmost distress, that they would preserve their own lives, and so find a city of their own, and that temple which was their peculiar. He then went round about the banks that were cast up, and hastened to them, in order to show that his word should in no long time be followed by his deeds. In answer to which the seditious cast reproaches upon Caesar himself, and upon his father also, and cried out with a loud voice that they contemned death, and did well in preferring it before slavery, that they would do all the mischief to the Romans they could while they had breath in them, and that for their own city, since they were, as he said, to be destroyed, they had no concern about it, and that the world itself was a better temple to God than this. Yet this temple would be preserved by him that inhabited therein, whom they still had for their assistant in this war, and did therefore laugh at all his threatenings, which would come to nothing, because the conclusion of the whole demanded upon God only. These words were mixed with reproaches, and with them they made a mighty clamor. In the meantime Antiochus Epiphanes came to the city, having with him a considerable number of other armed men, and a band called the Macedonian band about him, all the same age, tall, and just past their childhood, armed and instructed after the Macedonian manner, whence it was that they took that name. Yet were many of them unworthy of so famous a nation, for it had so happened that the king of Commagene had flourished more than any other kings that were under the power of the Romans, till a change happened in his condition, when he was become an old man, and he declared plainly that we ought not to call any man happy before he was dead. But this son of his, who was then come thither before his father was decaying, said that he could not but wonder what made the Romans so tardy in making their attacks upon the wall. Now he was a warlike man, and naturally bold in exposing himself to dangers. He was also so strong a man that his boldness seldom failed of having success. Upon this Titus smiled, and said he would share the pains of an attack with him. However, Antiochus went as he was, and with his Macedonians made a sudden assault upon the wall. And indeed, for his own part, his strength and skill were so great that he guarded himself from the Jewish darts, and yet shot his darts at them, while the young men with him were almost all sorely galled, for they had so great a regard to the promises that had been made of their courage, that they would needs persevere in their fighting, and at length many of them retired, but not till they were wounded, and then they perceived that true Macedonians, if they were to be conquerors, must have Alexander's good fortune also. Now as the Romans began to raise their banks on the 12th day of the month Artemisius or Jar, so they had much ado to finish them by the 29th day of the same month, after they had labored hard for 17 days continually. For there were now 4 great banks raised, one of which was at the tower of Antonia. This was raised by the 5th legion, over against the middle of that pool which is called Struthius. Another was cast up by the 12th legion, at a distance of about 20 cubits from the other. But the labors of the 10th legion, which lay a great way off of these, were on the north quarter, and at the pool called Amygdalon, as was that of the 15th legion, about 30 cubits from it, and at the high priest's monument. And now, when the engines were brought, John had from within undermined the space that was over against the tower of Antonia, as far as the banks themselves, and had supported the ground over the mine with beams laid across one another, whereby the Roman works stood upon an uncertain foundation. Then did he order such materials to be brought in as were daubed over with pitch and bitumen, and set them on fire. And as the cross beams that supported the banks were burning, the ditch yielded on the sudden, and the banks were shaken down, and fell into the ditch with a prodigious noise. Now at the first there arose a very thick smoke and dust, as the fire was choked with the fall of the bank. But as the suffocated materials were now gradually consumed, a plain flame broke out, on which sudden appearance of the flames a consternation fell upon the Romans, and the shrewdness of the contrivance discouraged them. And indeed this accident coming upon them at a time when they thought they had already gained their point, cooled their hopes for the time to come. They also thought it would be to no purpose to take the pains to extinguish the fire, since if it were extinguished, the banks were swallowed up already. 2 days after this, Simon and his party made an attempt to destroy other banks, for the Romans had brought their engines to bear there, and began already to make the wall shake. And here one Teptheus of Garsus, a city of Galilee, and Megasaurus, who was derived from some Queen Mariamne's servants, and with them one from Adiabene. He was the son of Nabateus, called by the name Jagiras, from the ill fortune he had, the word signifying a lame man, snatched some torches, and ran suddenly upon the engines. Nor were there during this war any men that ever sallied out of the city who were their superiors, either in their boldness or in the terror they struck into their enemies. For they ran out upon the Romans, not as if they were enemies, but friends, without fear or delay. Nor did they leave their enemies till they had rushed violently through the midst of them, and set their machines on fire. And though they had darts thrown at them on every side, and on every side assaulted with their enemies' swords, yet they did not withdraw themselves out of the dangers they were in, till the fire had caught hold of the instruments. But when the flame went up, the Romans came running from their camp to save their engines. Then did the Jews hinder their succourers from the wall, and fought with those that endeavored to quench the fire, without any regard to the danger their bodies were in. So the Romans pulled the engines out of the fire, while the hurdles that covered them were on fire. But the Jews caught hold of the battering rams through the flame itself, and held them fast, although the iron upon them was become red hot. And now the fire spread itself from the engines to the banks, and prevented those that came to defend them. And all this while the Romans were encompassed round about with the flame, and despairing of seeing their works from it, and they retired to camp. Then did the Jews become more and more in number by the coming of those that were within the city to their assistance. And as they were very bold upon the good success they had, their violent assaults were almost irresistible. Nay, they proceeded as far as the fortifications of the enemy's camp, and fought with their guards. Now there stood a body of soldiers in array before that camp, which succeeded one another by turns in their armor. And as to those, the law of the Romans was terrible, that he who left his post there, let the occasion be whatsoever it might be, he was to die for it. So that body of soldiers, preferring rather to die in fighting courageously, than as a punishment for their cowardice, stood firm. And at the necessity these men were in standing to it, many of the others that had run away out of shame turned back again. And when they had set the engines against the wall, they put the multitude from coming, more of them out of the city, because they had made no provision for preserving or guarding their bodies at this time. For the Jews fought now hand to hand with all that came in their way, and without any caution, fell against the points of their enemies' spears, and attacked them bodies against bodies. For they were now too hard for the Romans, not so much by their other warlike actions, as by these courageous assaults they made upon them. And the Romans gave way more to their boldness than they did to the sense of the harm they had received from them. And now Titus was come from the tower Antonia, whither he was gone to look out for a place for raising other banks, and reproached the soldiers greatly for permitting their own walls to be in danger. And when they had taken the walls of their enemies, and sustained the fortune of men besieged, while the Jews were allowed to sally out against them, though they were already in a sort of prison, he then went round about the enemy with some chosen troops, and fell upon their flank himself. So the Jews, who had been before assaulted in their faces, wheeled about to Titus, and continued the fight. The armies were now mixed, one among the other, and the dust that was raised so far hindered them from seeing one another, and the noise that was made so far hindered them from hearing one another, that neither side could discern an enemy from a friend. However, the Jews did not flinch, and though not so much for their real strength, but from their despair of deliverance. The Romans also would not yield, by reason of the regard they had to glory, and to their reputation in war, and because Caesar himself went into the danger before them, insomuch that I cannot but think the Romans would, in the conclusion, have now taken even the whole multitude of the Jews, so very angry they were at them, had these not prevented the upshot of the battle, and retired into the city. However, seeing the banks of the Romans were demolished, these Romans were very much cast down upon the loss of what had cost them so long in pains, and this in 1 hour's time. And many indeed despaired of taking the city with their usual engines of war only. Chapter 12. Titus thought fit to encompass the city round with a wall, after which the famine consumed the people by whole houses and families together. And now did Titus consult with his commanders what was to be done. Those that were of the warmest tempers thought he should bring the whole army against the city and storm the wall, for that hitherto no more than a part of their army had fought with the Jews, but that in case the entire army was to come at once, they would not be able to sustain their attacks, but would be overwhelmed by their darts. But of those that were for a more cautious management, some were for raising their banks again, and others advised to let the banks alone, but to lie still before the city, to guard against the coming out of the Jews, and against their carrying provisions into the city, and so to leave the enemy to the famine. And this was without direct fighting with them. For that despair was not to be conquered, especially as to those who are desirous to die by the sword, while a more terrible misery than that is reserved for them. However, Titus did not think it fit for so great an army to lie entirely idle, and that yet it was in vain to fight with those that would be destroyed one by another. He also showed them how impracticable it was to cast up any more banks, for want of materials, and to guard against the Jews coming out still more impracticable, as also that to encompass the whole city round with his army was not very easy, by reason of its magnitude, and the difficulty of the situation, and on other accounts dangerous upon the sallies the Jews might make out of the city. For although they might guard the known passages out of the place, yet would they, when they found themselves under the greatest distress, contrive secret passages out, as well as being acquainted with all such places, and if any provisions were carried in by stealth, the siege would thereby be longer delayed. He also owned that he was afraid that the length of time thus to be spent would diminish the glory of his success. For though it be true that length of time will perfect everything, yet that to do what we do in a little time is still necessary to the gaining reputation. That therefore his opinion was that if they aimed at quickness joined with security, they must build a wall round about the whole city, which was, he thought, the only way to prevent the Jews from coming out any way, and that then they would either entirely despair of saving the city, and so would surrender it up to him, or be still the more easily conquered when the famine had further weakened them. For that besides this wall he would not lie entirely at rest afterward, but would take care then to have banks raised again, when those that would oppose them were become weaker. But that if any one should think such a great work to be too great, and not to be finished without much difficulty, he ought to consider that it is not fit for Romans to undertake any small work, and that none but God himself could with ease accomplish any great thing whatsoever. These arguments prevailed with the commanders. So Titus gave orders that the army should be distributed to their several shares of this work, and indeed there now came upon the soldiers a certain divine fury, so that they did not only part the whole wall that was to be built among them, nor did only one legion strive with another, but lesser divisions of the army did the same, inasmuch that each soldier was ambitious to please his decurion, each decurion his centurion, and each centurion his tribune, and the ambition of the tribunes was to please their superior commanders, while Caesar himself took notice of and rewarded the like contention in those commanders, for he went round about the works many times every day, and took a view of what was done. Titus began the wall from the camp of the Assyrians, where his own camp was pitched, and drew it down to the lower parts of Sinopolis. Thence it went along the valley of Cedron to the Mount of Olives. It then bent towards the south and encompassed the mountain as far as the rock called Peristerion, and that other hill which lies next it, and is over the valley which reaches to Siloam, whence it bended again to the west, and went down to the valley of the fountain, beyond which it went up again at the monument of Ananus the high priest. And encompassing that mountain where Pompey had formerly pitched his camp, it returned back to the north side of the city, and was carried on as far as a certain village called the House of the Arabinthi, after which it encompassed Herod's monument, and there on the east was joined to Titus's own camp where it began. Now the length of this wall was 40 furlongs, one only abated. Now this wall without were erected 13 places to keep garrison in, whose circumferences put together amounted to 10 furlongs. The whole was completed in 3 days, so that what would naturally have required some months was done in so short an interval as is incredible. When Titus had therefore encompassed the city with this wall, and put garrisons into proper places, he went round the wall at the first watch of the night, and observed how the guard was kept. The second watch he allotted to Alexander. The commanders of legions took the third watch. They also cast lots among themselves who should be upon the watch in the night time, and who should go all night long round the spaces that were interposed between the garrisons. So all hope of escaping now was cut off from the Jews, together with their liberty of going out of the city. Then did the famine widen its progress, and devoured the people by whole houses and families. The upper rooms were full of women and children that were dying by famine, and the lanes of the city were full of the dead bodies of the aged. The children also and the young men wandered about the marketplaces like shadows, all swelled with the famine, and fell down dead, wheresoever their misery seized them. As for burying them, those that were sick themselves were not able to do it, and those that were hearty and well were deterred from doing it by the great multitude of those dead bodies, and by the uncertainty there was how soon they should die themselves. For many died as they were burying others, and many went to their coffins before that fatal hour was come. Nor was there any lamentations made under those calamities, nor were heard any mournful complaints, but the famine confounded all natural passions. For those who were just going to die looked upon those that were gone to rest before them with dry eyes and open mouths. A deep silence also, and a kind of deadly night, had seized upon the city, while yet the robbers were still more terrible than those miseries themselves. For they brake upon those houses which were no other than graves of dead bodies, and plundered them of what they had, and carrying off the coverings of their bodies, went out laughing, and tried the points of their swords in their dead bodies, and, in order to prove what metal they were made of, they thrust some of those through that still lay alive upon the ground. But for those that entreated them to lend them their right hand and their sword to dispatch them, they were too proud to grant their requests, and left them to be consumed by the famine. Now every one of these died with their eyes fixed upon the temple, and left the seditious alive behind them. Now the seditious at first gave orders that the dead should be buried out of the public treasury, as not enduring the stench of their dead bodies. But afterwards, when they could not do that, they had them cast down from the walls into the valleys beneath. However, when Titus, in going his rounds along those valleys, saw them full of dead bodies, and the thick putrefaction running about them, he gave a groan, and spreading out his hands to heaven, called God to witness that this was not his doing, and such was the sad case of the city itself. But the Romans were very joyful, since none of the seditious would now make sallies out of the city, because they were themselves disconsolate, and the famine already touched them also. These Romans besides had great plenty of corn and other necessaries out of Syria, and out of the neighboring provinces, many of whom would stand near to the wall of the city, and show the people what great quantities of provisions they had, and so make the enemy more sensible of their famine by the great plenty, even to satiety, which they had themselves. However, when the seditious still showed no inclinations of yielding, Titus, out of his commiseration of the people that remained, and out of his earnest desire of rescuing what was still left out of those miseries, began to raise his banks again, although materials for them were hard to come at. For all the trees that were about the city had already been cut down for the making of the former banks. Yet did the soldiers bring with them other materials from the distance of 90 furlongs, and thereby raised banks in 4 parts, much greater than the former, though this was done only at the tower of Antonia. So Caesar went his rounds through the legions, and hastened on the works, and showed the robbers that they were now in his hands. But these men, and these only, were incapable of repenting of the wickedness which they had been guilty of, and separating their souls from their bodies, they used them both as if they belonged to other folks, and not to themselves. For no gentle affection could touch their souls, nor could any pain affect their bodies, since they could still tear the dead bodies of the people as dogs do, and fill the prisons with those that were sick. Chapter 13. The great slaughters and sacrilege that were in Jerusalem. Accordingly, Simon would not suffer Matthias, by whose means he got possession of the city, to go off without torment. This Matthias was the son of Boethus, and was one of the high priests, one that had been very faithful to the people, and in great esteem with them. He, when the multitude were distressed by the zealots, among whom John was numbered, persuaded the people to admit this Simon to come in to assist them, while he had made no terms with him, nor expected anything that was evil from him. But when Simon was come in, and had gotten the city under his power, he had esteemed him that had advised them to commit him as his enemy equally with the rest, as looking upon that advice as a place of his simplicity only. So he had him then brought before him, and condemned him to die for being on the side of the Romans, without giving him leave to make his defense. He condemned also his 3 sons to die with him, and as for the 4th, he prevented him by running away to Titus before. When he begged for this, that he might be slain before his sons, and that as a favor, on account that he had procured the gates of the city to be opened to him, he gave order that he should be slain the last of them all. So he was not slain till he had seen his son slain before his eyes, and that by being produced over against the Romans. for such a charge had Simon given to Artanus, the son of Bamidus, who was the most barbarous of all of his guards. He also jested upon him, and told him he might now see whether those to whom he intended to go over would send him any succours or not. But he still forbade their dead bodies should be buried. After the slaughter of these, a certain priest, Ananias, the son of Massambulus, a person of eminency, and also Ariston, the scribe of the Sanhedrim, and born of Emmaus, and with them 15 men of figure among the public were slain. They also kept Josephus' father in prison, and made public proclamation that no citizen whosoever should either speak to him himself or go into his company among others, for fear he should betray them. They also slew such as joined in lamenting these men, without any further examination. Now when Judas, the son of Judas, who was one of Simon's under-officers, and a person entrusted by him to keep one of the towers, saw this procedure of Simon, he called together 10 of those under him, that were most faithful to him. Perhaps this was done partly out of pity to those that had so barbarously been put to death, but principally in order to provide for his own safety, and spoke thus to them, quote, "How long shall we bear these miseries? Or what hopes have we of deliverance by thus continuing faithful to such wicked wretches? Is not the famine already come against us? Are not the Romans in a manner gotten within the city? Is not Simon become unfaithful to his benefactors? And is there not reason to fear he will very soon bring us to the like punishment, while the security the Romans offer us is sure? Come on, let us surrender up this wall, and save ourselves and the city. Nor will Simon be very much hurt, if now he despairs of deliverance, he be brought to justice a little sooner than he thinks on." Unquote. Now these 10 were prevailed upon by those arguments, so he sent the rest of those that were under him, some one way, some another, that no discovery might be made of what they had resolved upon. Accordingly he called out to the Romans from the tower about the 3rd hour, but they, some of them out of pride, despised what he said, and others of them did not believe him to be in earnest, though the greatest number delayed the matter, as believing they should get possession of the city in a little time without any hazard. But when Titus was just coming thither with his armed men, Simon was acquainted with the matter before he came, and presently took the tower into his own custody, before it was surrendered, and seized upon these men, and put them to death in the sight of the Romans themselves. And when he had mangled their dead bodies, he threw them down before the wall of the city. In the meantime, Josephus, as he was going round the city, had his head wounded by a stone that was thrown at him, upon which he fell down as giddy. Upon which fall of his the Jews made a sally, and he had been hurried away into the city, if Caesar had not sent men to protect him immediately, as these men were fighting. Josephus was taken up, though he heard little of what was done. So the seditious supposed that they had now slain that man whom they were most desirous of killing, and made thereupon a great noise in way of rejoicing. This accident was told in the city, and the multitude that remained became very disconsolate at the news, as being persuaded that he was really dead, on whose account alone they could venture to desert to the Romans. But when Josephus' mother heard in prison that her son was dead, she said to those that watched about her that she had always been of the opinion since the siege of Jotopada that he would be slain, and she should never enjoy him alive any more. She also made great lamentation privately to the maidservants that were about her, and said that this was all the advantage she had of bringing so extraordinary a person as this son into the world, that she should not be able even to bury that son of hers, by whom she expected to have been buried herself. However, this false report did not put his mother to pain, nor afford merriment to the robbers long, for Josephus soon recovered of his wound, and came out and cried out aloud, that it would not be long ere they should be punished for this wound they had given him. He also made a fresh exhortation to the people to come out upon the security that would be given them. This sight of Josephus encouraged the people greatly, and brought a great consternation upon the seditious. Hereupon some of the deserters, having no other way, leaped down from the wall immediately, while others of them went out of the city with stones, as if they would fight them, but thereupon they fled away to the Romans. But here a worse fate accompanied these than what they had found within the city, and they met with a quicker dispatch from the too great abundance they had among the Romans, than they could have done from the famine among the Jews. For when they came first to the Romans, they were puffed up by the famine, and swelled like men in a dropsy, after which they all on the sudden overfilled those bodies that were before empty, and so burst asunder, accepting such only as were skillful enough to restrain their appetites, and by degrees took in their food into bodies unaccustomed thereto. Yet did another plague seize upon those that were thus preserved, for there was found among the Syrian deserters a certain person who was caught gathering pieces of gold out of the excrements of the Jews' bellies, for the deserters used to swallow such pieces of gold, as we told you before, when they came out. And for these did the seditious search them all, for there was a great quantity of gold in the city, insomuch that as much as now sold in the Roman camp for 12 attic or drams, as was sold before for 25. But when this contrivance was discovered in one instance, the fame of it filled their several camps, that the deserters came to them full of gold. So the multitude of the Arabians, with the Syrians, cut up those that came as supplicants, and searched their bellies. Nor does it seem to me that any misery befell the Jews that was more terrible than this, since in one night's time about 2,000 of those deserters were thus dissected. When Titus came to the knowledge of this wicked practice, he had like to have surrounded those that had been guilty of it with his horse, and have shot them dead, and he had done it, had not their number been so very great, and those that were liable to this punishment would have been manifold more than those whom they had slain. However, he called together his commanders of the auxiliary troops he had with him, as well as the commanders of the Roman legions, for some of his own soldiers had been also guilty herein, as he had been informed, and had great indignation against both sorts of them, and said to them, quote, "What? Have any of my own soldiers done such things as this out of the uncertain hope of gain, without regarding their own weapons, which are made of silver and gold? Moreover, do the Arabians and Syrians now, first of all, begin to govern themselves as they please, and to indulge their appetites in a foreign war, and then, out of their barbarity in murdering men, and out of their hatred to the Jews, get it ascribed to the Romans?" Unquote. For this infamous practice was said to be spread among some of his own soldiers also. Titus then threatened that he would put such men to death, if any of them were discovered, as to be so insolent as to do it again. Moreover, he gave it in charge to the legions, that they should make a search after such were suspected, and should bring them to him. But it appeared that the love of money was too hard for all their dread of punishment, and a vehement desire of gain is natural to men, and no passion is so venturesome as covetousness. Otherwise such passions have certain bounds, and are subordinate to fear. But in reality it was God who condemned the whole nation, and turned every course that was taken for their preservation to their destruction. This therefore, which was forbidden by Caesar under such a threatening, was ventured upon privately against the deserters, and these barbarians would go out still, and meet those that ran away before any saw them, and looking about them to see that no Roman spied them, they dissected them, and pulled this polluted money out of their bowels, which money was still found in a few of them. Yet while a great many were destroyed by the bare hope that there was thus getting by them, which miserable treatment made many that were deserting to return back into the city. But as for John, when he could no longer plunder the people, he betook himself to sacrilege, and melted down many of the sacred utensils which had been given to the temple, and also many of those vessels which were necessary for such a ministered about holy things, the cauldrons, the dishes, and the tables. Nay, he did not abstain from those pouring vessels that were sent them by Augustus and his wife. For the Roman emperors did ever both honor and adorn this temple, whereas this man, who was a Jew, seized upon what were the donations of foreigners, and said to those that were with him, that it was proper for them to use divine things, while they were fighting for the divinity, without fear, that such whose warfare is for the temple should live of the temple. On which account he emptied the vessels of that sacred wine and oil, which the priests kept to be poured on the burnt offerings, and which lay in the inner court of the temple, and distributed it among the multitude, who, in their anointing themselves and drinking, used each of them above an hin of them. And here I cannot but speak my mind, what the concern I am under dictates to me, and it is this. I suppose that the Romans made any longer delay in coming out against these villains, that the city would either have been swallowed up by the ground opening upon them, or have been overflowed by water, or else been destroyed by such thunder as the country of Sodom perished by. For it had brought forth a generation of men much more atheistical than were those that suffered such punishments. For by their madness it was all that the people came to be destroyed. And indeed, why do I relate these particular calamities? While Manaeus, the son of Lazarus, came running to Titus at this very time, and told him that there had been carried out through that one gate, which was entrusted to his care, no fewer than 115,880 dead bodies in the interval between the 14th day of the month of Xanthias, or Nisan, when the Romans pitched their camp by the city, and the first day of the month Panemus, or Tammuz. This was itself a prodigious multitude, and though this man was not himself set as governor of that gate, yet he was appointed to pay the public stipend for carrying these bodies out, and was so obliged of necessity to number them, while the rest were buried by their relations, though all their burial was but this, to bring them away, and cast them out of the city. After this man ran away to Titus many of the eminent citizens, and told them the entire number of the poor that were dead, and no fewer than 600,000 were thrown out the gates, though still the number of the rest could not be discovered. And they told him further that when they were no longer able to carry out the dead bodies of the poor, they laid their corpses on heaps in very large houses, and shut them up therein, and also that a medimnus of wheat was sold for a talent, and that when, a while afterward, it was not possible to gather herbs, by reason of the city was walled about, some persons were driven to that terrible distress as to search the common sewers and old dunghills of cattle, and to eat the dung which they got there. And what they of old could not endure so much as to see, they now use for food. When the Romans barely heard all this, they commiserated their case, while the seditious, who saw it also, did not repent, but suffered the same distress to come upon themselves, for they were blinded by that fate which was already coming upon the city, and upon themselves also.